Hello, welcome to another episode of the Access Vikings podcast. My name is Andrew Krammer, joined by Ben Goessling and Emily Leiker of the Star Tribune. We are here at TCO Performance Center in Eagan, where the Vikings are wrapping things up for the 2024 season. We just heard from Kevin O'Connell. Yep. We heard from Kwesi Adofo-Mensah about a lot of things, namely the quarterback situation, Sam Darnold, McCarthy, all of their good options that they've got to go into this offseason, and they're certainly going to have to sift through all of those. I think we should start with what dominated the conversation, because we'll get to things like their contract situations, what they're going to do at running back, offensive line, just a lot of topics. But Ben, what they're doing with Sam Darnold is what fans want to know. They want to know, do they want to bring him back after how that ended? They didn't exactly say no.
No, they didn't say no. They didn't say yes definitively. There was no, like, Sam Darnold will be our quarterback in 2025 types of pronouncements. I think they were encouraged. They sounded optimistic about McCarthy and the progress he's made. Kevin O'Connell did say today that McCarthy has resumed on-field training, so he's able to go out and work out on the field now, and I presume will continue to do that as much as he can this offseason. So the question with him is going to be, did he get enough out of this year to possibly be the starter in 2025? And they talked about they were happy with what he was able to do. How much of this can approximate what it would have been like to actually play? I don't know how much that can happen. But there was nothing in what they said about McCarthy to make you think they don't feel good about where he's at, and they don't feel good about what he could do in 2025. How that impacts Darnold, we'll see. But they talked about options a lot, and they certainly seem intent on making it appear as though they are still considering all of those options for now.
Yeah, both of them said Sam Darnold did a lot of fantastic things this year, but Kevin O'Connell mentioned that it's my job to pour over what went wrong, how it ended, all those things. He'd mentioned through a flu, no less, his end-of-season sickness. He'd mentioned already having gone through that Rams film so many times to figure out what went wrong, why it went wrong. Emily, what stood out to you just about the tenor of this conversation here and what they had to say at quarterback?
Yeah, one of the lines that stood out to me most was something that Kwesi said, and it was like, none of this is a binary situation. And I think it's easy to talk about it like it's like a clear black and white, like let Sam go or not let Sam go and all of this stuff, and it's not.
Stories are easy to write if it's a binary situation.
Right. There's a lot of gray area. There's the Daniel Jones of it all that you also have to factor in. There's, is JJ ready from the on-field perspective? I think he's probably in a lot better place from the mental side of things in that part of the game than he would have been if they had tried to thrust him in as a true rookie, just because I think there are a lot of differences between the college and the pro game now. And so I think probably getting to see that from an off-the-field sideline perspective and learn in that way was good for him. But there is a lot of muck to rake through here and go through for all of them, for all of us. I'm sure we'll continue talking about this for weeks to come until a decision is finally made.
Yeah, and it is a worthwhile update that JJ is running on the field, doing on-field training, considering he had a second procedure on that right knee. Is that November?
Yes.
To address swelling that had popped up in that knee, but they didn't say anything about any fears or concerns that he would not be ready for this summer for the preparation of the 2025 season. That puts him firmly among their good options, as Kwesi talked about what they've got at quarterback. But we should talk about Sam Darnold some more. The season he had, the expectations they had for him. I thought it was interesting that Kwesi had mentioned we didn't necessarily put a timeline on McCarthy, the rookie deal, kind of when he left unsaid, kind of when the time would begin for him, when his time would begin. He said, though, that we all thought Sam would have a good season. So Kwesi also said, I'd ask Kevin about what would it take to change your mind about presumably this quarterback. So we had those discussions. Kwesi, he wouldn't go as far as to say I thought he'd be a Pro Bowl quarterback, but that's what Sam exactly was.
Yeah.
What did you think about just those expectations that we all had, including the front office here, about Sam? And do you think, based on those comments, that has changed anything, his season?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of what he did, Kevin O'Connell said I expected him to do this.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, you may have expected that it's possible for him to do this, but to say that it was certain that he was going to do this, I'm not sure that anybody would go that far. I mean, Kwesi basically said, did I know this was going to be a 14-win team? And I've had enough conversations with people in this building. I mean, one of the things that Kwesi is very honest about is the fact that nobody knows for sure. As much as we want to make these things seem like, you see things covered this way all the time. When somebody does something right, the postmortem is always, they knew this would work, they were certain this was a great idea, and there was never any possibility it wasn't, Kwesi will say out loud that, hey, we're playing probabilities here. When he talks about Monte Carlo simulations, it's that we ran this simulation 1,000 times, and in 624 of them, this is what happened. I mean, that's the world he lives in. So was there a world where Sam Darnold could do this? Sure. Was it every single scenario that Sam Darnold was going to do this? No. So I think it does change the viewpoint of him, seeing that he was able to do this in year one and knowing that he probably has more in him in this offense. But I also think, when you draft a guy 10th overall, that guys you draft that high play.
Yeah.
And I think they were excited enough about J.J. McCarthy. I think there was getting to be a shorter time frame in terms of what they thought J.J. McCarthy would need to be ready to play before he gets injured. I mean, I think a lot of those things were starting to be discussion points of, hey, how long do we need to wait on this guy? Does it need to be the entire year?
Yeah.
Or is it maybe somewhere in the middle of 2024? And if you're thinking about that, it says something about J.J. McCarthy. It also says something about, we're not sure that Sam Darnold is going to be Pro Bowl quarterback all season. I don't think anybody was completely certain at the beginning of the season that was going to happen. So I think a lot of what he did probably changes the discussion, because you just don't see guys play at that level very often. And if you have one, you have to think about what that may look like going forward.
And I don't think that the past two games changed the perception of him as much as people in the public would think that it did, just based on some of the things that were said. Like O'Connell talked about how many other things have to happen in a game for you to win, how many other things go wrong for you to lose. So they're thinking about a lot more than Sam's performance, and they're not taking Sam's performance insularly, I think.
But at the same time, it's probably worth mentioning that nobody said we want Sam Darnold to be our quarterback. And again, we're shifting this conversation towards the binary when they don't really want to. But they also, I think, know that if you don't say those things, it is going to invite a lot of discussion about where is this going to go. And we have not seen them really commit to a quarterback in this organization other than J.J. McCarthy, in the sense that you drafted him. I mean, they say a lot of things about Kirk Cousins. We want him back. There's a price point to this, and I think that's going to be the case here too.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see how they go about this, because these discussions have to be had still. Kevin O'Connell did say this is way too early for us to make this kind of decision or even put any kind of stamp on the direction they want to go. But what they did in this press conference was kept all their options open. What they did was kept open the possibility of, he wasn't asked about this, but potentially franchise tagging Darnold and keeping his trade value up as a guy you did not close the door on. Closing the door on Sam, just from an objective standpoint, wouldn't do you any good.
Right.
Wouldn't do you any good as far as asset management, especially if you decide to keep the guy and tag him. So I wasn't expecting a convicted answer here today. We didn't get one. But it is good news for Vikings fans that, from all accounts, what they said today is that J.J. McCarthy is at least back on the field throwing and doing those things that would get him toward the possibility of being an option. Because, Ben, they were asked directly, could J.J. McCarthy start week one? And we didn't get a clear answer on that either.
No, and they said he'll be able to go through a full offseason. Kevin O'Connell talked about he's ready to be where we expected him to be, or something to that effect. That is a big step, but then you still have to see him go through the full offseason, go through the full training camp, full preseason. He didn't do that, obviously, because of the knee injury. So there's a lot there to figure out, and a lot of what they're going to have to decide between now and March is, do you feel confident enough in what J.J. McCarthy's been able to do that you are willing to move on from Sam Darnold? Or is there a price point at which you can bring Sam Darnold back, and how much of that will be affected by your confidence level in J.J. McCarthy, or wherever else you may go for another veteran quarterback? Maybe that's Daniel Jones, maybe that's somebody else. A lot of that stuff will have to be figured out before McCarthy plays a game or even really practices. So there is a certain amount of projection that goes into this, even before you're going to have a lot of the answers to McCarthy questions.
And Emily Kwesi went as far as to even say with Daniel Jones that part of the cool part of bringing him in was to assess the potential future with him. So when they talk about all the good options, he's kind of that third wheel that we'd have to throw in there. But it's somebody that they brought up kind of unprompted today.
Yeah, very much still in that conversation. It seemed like, Kwesi talked about they were familiar with like the talent level, right? But the whole point of bringing him in was seeing how he could do in the room. And we got to talk to Daniel last week for the first time since he had arrived. And by all accounts, everyone in that QB room has loved having him here. He's loved being here. So that is certainly an intriguing thing that goes into this mix that I think got on the back burner for a little bit when he was just down on the practice squad. But since they elevated him and obviously the comp pick comes in and all of that, it gets interesting.
Yeah, they didn't close the door on him either, but as Ben's mentioning, they didn't marry themselves to anybody at all either. So speaking of that, marriages, the Vikings have 2 contract situations open with Kevin O'Connell and Kwesi, the 2 men we just heard from today on Thursday at TCO. And both of them said that they obviously love being here, want to be here. Both of them are different situations, obviously. How did you assess kind of what we heard from both of these guys?
Yeah, I mean, neither one was going to say a lot. It was interesting that they both already talked with the Wilfs, and the Wilfs said in December, when I talked to Mark Wilf, he said, we look forward to having these conversations after the season, which tracked with what they had said, back in August as well. And that's kind of their normal process. They talk with these guys every week. They have a call with Kevin O'Connell and with Kwesi Adofo-Mensah every single week after every game. And there's a larger leadership call on Wednesdays. I think Kwesi is probably part of some of those more than Kevin is, because Kevin has other things to do during the football season that are a little more, narrow focused. But it was interesting that they've had some of these conversations already, probably at least to kind of level set of, hey, this is what we're thinking. We want to get something done. Let's talk more when your agents get involved and all of those things. But both of them said they want to be here, which I would expect that they would say. And I think it's going to be something that is a front burner topic, I would expect pretty quickly. I mean, I think they'll try to get these things done relatively soon, because there's just so many questions that get set aside or answered if you get them done. I mean, you're not probably going to have to worry about, are they making the right long-term quarterback decision if they have contracts settled. That takes out any conflict of interest you might have. And we saw that, frankly, in 2021.
Yep.
There were a general manager and a coach that were trying to save their jobs. They got contract extensions, but I think those happened so late that a lot of the moves they made were affected by, hey, we need to field a good enough team to save our jobs. That's not going to be the case necessarily here, because this is a team coming off of a 14-win season. But you do take any of that discussion out of the mix if they have contracts done before they have to make a call on the quarterback. So I would expect that we will see this thing move pretty soon. And there's a lot of coaching stuff that is going to play out over the next few weeks here, with Brian Flores interviewing for jobs, Josh McCown interviewing with the Jets, Grant Udinski, a candidate for the Seahawks offensive coordinator job at age 28. So all of that stuff becomes easier to deal with, I think, if you have leadership locked and loaded. It'll be, we can ask the question of, will they do the same length of contract? Will they get, they've liked to have the coach and the GM matched up in terms of how long their contracts are. Will they do that here? Does Kevin O'Connell want anything else besides just term and money? All of those things are discussion points they weren't going to get into today, and they basically bypassed the opportunity to do so. But yeah, I think this stuff will become an item on pretty high on everybody's to-do list pretty quickly.
Well, let me take you into waters that I know you don't love going into, but if you could speculate, what do you think? What would Kevin O'Connell want in addition to such things? And also, what do you make of the direct question he did face today of, there's talk about tension behind the scenes in terms of wanting this deal and it not being done yet?
Okay, so tension, that has come up a couple of times. I don't think there's tension in the sense of they've had discussions that haven't gone well. I think a lot of it has just been, hey, when are we going to do this? And a lot of that, I know when it came up in August, that was a sticking point for people in terms of them saying we weren't going to do this until after the season. But this is also the Wilfs' normal process. They did Mike Zimmer's deal, his first one, after 2 years, and we asked a lot of those questions. I know I was thinking that going into that press conference with Mark Wilf, hey, this was the same time frame that he did Mike Zimmer's, but their second and third deals with Zimmer were a year before it was done. So that was, probably in some cases, us jumping the gun a little, asking those questions as much as we did, and you have to ask them. But I don't think there's tension, like I say, in a sense that they've talked and talks have broken off and people aren't on the same page. I think it's just been there haven't been conversations yet, and then you start to wonder, okay, are you happy with me? It's just that you want to do this later, or is this a sign that you're not happy with me? People kind of wonder those things if there's not communication and conversations about it, and I think that is happening now. So a lot of that stuff's going to get cleared up. I don't think that it's something where talks have gone badly. I don't think that's the case at all. What happens here? What does Kevin O'Connell want? I think a long-term deal, certainly, and you kind of know you're going to be the guy. I think he understands that he's got a fair amount of equity built up here and a lot of reputational equity built up around the league. Like, that does translate to dollars. I mean, there's no doubt about it that he is due for a raise. He has coached in a way that he's, I would think, going to be a finalist for Coach of the Year, may win Coach of the Year. We'll see about that in a few weeks. But all of that stuff creates leverage, which creates dollars. This idea of does he want more control of the roster? I don't know that. I don't think that's something that is like a top of line thing for him. I think he does end up involved in these things only in the sense that when you are trying to work with players who are having contract issues, you do kind of have to have that line of communication open of say, hey, this is not personal. Yeah. We don't want anybody to take this personally. So I know he is a big factor in those situations. So, but is that more say over the roster? I haven't heard that from anybody specifically. Doesn't mean that it's not a thought, but I haven't heard that. I think it gets done. I think it's, probably making him one of the higher paid coaches in the league. All of that kind of stuff I think is very much on his mind. But as far as tension, I don't think it's been more about just this uncertainty rather than any type of conversations that I know of that have been heated or anything like that. I don't think that's happened.
The last point, Emily, you had brought up about how Sam Darnold's end affects, kind of how we view him or how the Wilfs view him or ownership, or leadership for the team. But Ben, how do you think the way that he's 0-2 now, O'Connell in the playoffs, affects this? When you talk about leverage, you talk about kind of him being respected around the league as he is. He develops Sam Darnold into a guy who's a 4,000-yard passer. Not very many coaches can do that, but he's also 0-2 in the playoffs.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, we talked about it last week that the people that had a lot to gain from that playoff game, Kevin O'Connell, Sam Darnold, probably Brian Flores to a degree, nobody came out of that having increased their leverage. I mean, as much as we could talk about Kevin O'Connell having increased his leverage with this season that he had, I mean, the deal he's going to get now is way better than the deal he probably would have gotten in August, because now he's got a 14-win season, a Pro Bowl quarterback that everybody had given up on. He starts being talked about as a quarterback whisperer. That was not happening in August, and now it is. That does create leverage. At the same time as that, being 0-2 in the playoffs does not help, because playoff wins create currency. Playoff wins create market value. They create reputational value for owners. I mean, owners love to go to those confabs that they have among different owners, whether it's at the owners' meetings or different league meetings they have throughout the year, and be the ones that said, yeah, we were playing deep into the playoffs. We were one of the last 4 teams or 8 teams playing, whatever it is. Yeah. So playoff wins do matter. I think there's no doubt about that, and the Wilfs have, I think, 3 of them in 20 years of ownership. So 2009, 2017, and 2019, I believe, are the only times they've won playoff games. Yep. So does that mean he's not getting a deal? No. But would he be in an even stronger position if they had won that game last week? Yes. I think that's certainly part of the equation.
Yeah, the Vikings did end up with their best point differential since the last time they won a playoff game in 2019, but they're still waiting now 5 straight years without a playoff win since then. Emily, a big part of their team was obviously Aaron Jones and what they did in the running game. You talked to Aaron Jones after the game on Monday night. We just heard from Kevin O'Connell about the run game. What is the future at that position? We've gotten a lot of questions from fans wanting to know, will Aaron Jones stick around? Is it going to be a new lead back? I mean, what's your sense based on everything you've heard?
Yeah, both Aaron Jones and Cam Akers, who obviously came in at that mid-season point with the trade, both said they wanted to be back next year and would love to be here. I thought it was interesting that O'Connell praised them both, had good things to say about them both, and Ty Chandler, But he did kind of say in addressing the run game and fixing some of the problems there, like they have to look at, is there better personnel we can bring in, different personnel that fits with what they're doing with their quarterbacks, which is obviously, as we were just talking about, his specialties. So I don't know. I think they really like Jones, and I think it's good to have a veteran in that backfield, especially if you're bringing in a younger quarterback and just someone that maybe balances that out a little bit. But they're going to have to do a lot of thinking around that run game and how they can solve that. I mean, the issues in the red zone with not being able to rush in a touchdown, all of the negative yardage plays, stuff like that. So there's a lot to shift through there.
Yeah, and Aaron did not, as good as he was, it was almost a career high in yardage. I don't know if he got there for...
I think it was a career high in yardage.
For scrimmage yards, was it?
Scrimmage yards, rushing yards, yes.
Oh,
yeah.
Scrimmage yards, I don't know. Probably not.
He was near it. He was 80 yards shy going into the last game in Detroit. I don't think he hit it.
No, I don't think so.
But it was great. Like, he was good for most of the
Yeah.
year. But at the end of the year, both in Detroit and against the Rams, he didn't look like the same guy.
No, he didn't. I mean, he played through a lot of injuries. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, whether it was the ribs, he had the knee stuff, he had a hamstring after coming out of London. So, and he's a running back that's 30 years old. Hasn't had a lot of heavy carry seasons. Doesn't have 280, 300 carry seasons, anything like that on his resume. In fact, I think he hit a career high in carries this year. But, yeah, I think that's a position they're going to have to address. I mean, the line, yes. But I feel like a younger back that's dynamic, that has a little more top-end speed. Jones, I think, can still run, but having a game-breaker type would help them. And just a guy that... Jones does a great job of making something out of nothing in terms of not having big holes to come through. He's pretty good at finding the small crevices to get himself through.
Yep.
But I think having a guy that is a little better at the second level of that, if you can find that back... maybe it's a third-round pick or something like that. I think that's a worthwhile investment.
Yeah, guys who could turn the 20-yard run into a 50-yard run, touchdown, home run kind of stuff. Stuff that we did see Dalvin Cook do, but didn't have the efficiency that Aaron...
Which is why they gave up on him. Yeah. But then I think they have suffered a little bit in that regard with not having guys that get a few more chunks.
Yeah, and another topic of discussion with this Vikings offense has been that interior line. Fans have been asking about it. The leadership has been getting questions about it. Kevin O'Connell said at the end of the game or after the game that he admitted that is a spot that they have to look at and get better at. And Kwesi did say today, I agree with what he had to say. And then he went on to talk about it some more. Ben, starting with you, we've talked about this every year ad nauseum.
Yeah.
The O-line. Every year it's new guards. Every year it's... How drastic do you think these changes could be realistically, considering all the other stuff they have to do on this team? They have 26 unrestricted and restricted free agents. How realistic is it for them to actually change much? Or am I underselling it? Do you think they will kind of go full bore?
Well, Kwesi talked about this too. He said maybe it's free agency or maybe it's guys on this roster that get better.
Yeah.
Like
more Blake Brandel.
Who is that exactly? I would like to know.
Walter
Is it Michael
Rouse?
Juergens?
Walter Rouse.
I mean,
maybe.
Walter Rouse possibly.
Guard.
Yeah, I think that's, maybe that's an answer. But the free agent market, and I haven't been through it a ton yet. Trey Smith's going to be the name that comes up the most if he makes it to free agency. There are a lot of guys that are kind of in that 29, 30-year-old range that probably aren't massive upgrades in terms of what they have now. It's something they're going to have to address, and they may go out and spend. They have the money to go out and spend on Trey Smith if that's something they wanted to do. But I don't think it's a terribly deep free agent market beyond that. So it could be something that they look to in the draft as well. Yeah. I mean, you have a first-round pick. I could see if there's a guard they liked, maybe you do that. But then you have to have that guy ready to play right away, which, as we saw with Ed Ingram, is not always automatic either.
No, it's not. And when Kwesi's getting asked about his draft history, his free agency history, much of it, especially the draft stuff, hangs on the fact that only half of the guys he took in 2022 and 2023 are still here.
Yeah.
And the half that are still here include Ed Ingram.
Yeah.
They include Brian Asamoah. They include guys that didn't contribute a whole ton to what they're doing. Emily, in terms of the O-line stuff, was there anything else that stood out to you about just what they had to say about it or kind of how the season ended in part because of their failures there?
I mean, I think the biggest thing for me was the fact that it was left at maybe we just work with the personnel we had here. Like, that was kind of a little bit, I was like, like maybe we need to be a little bit more straightforward about this one. And so that was really what stood out to me. And, I'm trying to think back to covering college this year if there's any linemen that I think they could grab. But I think to Ben's point, like those are guys that you have to develop. Like a 22-year-old offensive lineman looks a lot different than a 28-year-old offensive lineman and stuff like that. There's only so much you can do in an off season to bulk them up, get them ready.
Yeah, and there's so much of this, and we hear about this from coaches all the time, of the number of college teams that do not play an NFL-style offense. Like Iowa does, Wisconsin does, and you see a lot of linemen from those schools come to the NFL. Michigan has been that, especially over the Harbaugh years. But if you're talking about teams that the quarterback is one read and you don't have to block for more than a second and a half, that doesn't translate to the NFL, obviously, because we saw it Monday night. You have to be able to do that with a quarterback that either holds the ball or just needs to be able to get through his progressions. So the supply of linemen, because of the way college teams play, is not terribly good either.
Yeah, you see how tough it is for anybody to transition consistently. I can't remember, it was some Big 12 offensive lineman they took within the last 5 or 10 years that said, I haven't put my hand in the dirt in like years because we just ran an air raid where I just kind of sat up in a 2-point stance and dropped back every play 50 times a game.
It's like somebody from Oklahoma, maybe.
It might have been.
I feel like there was an Oklahoma lineman that this sounds familiar.
Probably. It's just the point is, to your point, that it's tough to pick those guys, have them transit right away. And then as we talk about transitioning quarterbacks, if it's not Sam Darnold, if it is going to be J.J. McCarthy, combination of Daniel Jones and McCarthy, how much more do you want to shore up that front, considering the consistency might not be the same at quarterback?
Yeah, I think that would be a big need. You do not, I mean, when they talk about teams that ruin quarterbacks, I mean, the easiest and most direct way to ruin a quarterback is to have him running for his life. I mean, probably the greatest example of this is David Carr, Derek's older brother, first pick in the draft. The Texans, their first year in the league, got sacked I think it was 80 times.
It's a record then.
Yeah, and you're playing behind an expansion team offensive line, but he was never the same. I mean, and I think you even saw it with Darnold at times this year, where the pressure starts to get to him, and his feet get happy, or he's just not able to get through his reads with the same level of confidence because he's not working from a clean pocket. That absolutely has to be a factor with a young quarterback, especially one that is used to playing behind good offensive lines, because Michigan always has them. So, he's mobile. We've seen that, but he's also coming off a knee surgery that you don't really want to have to risk that again. So, not saying he's going to be pocket passer guy, but you also don't want to put unnecessary hits and unnecessary toll on his body, given the fact that he's come off of meniscus surgery already. So, yes, I think shoring up the offensive line is a major need, especially if J.J. McCarthy's the quarterback.
In that film that Kevin O'Connell talked about breaking down ad nauseum, the Monday night film against the Rams, there have been good breakdowns from Dan Orlovsky with ESPN, from Greg Cosell, also at ESPN, about how the Vikings offensive line just got targeted, the interior did, as far as protections, knowing the rules of the protections, knowing how to beat them, knowing how to stress those guys in the middle. And that's the same story of what derailed the 2019 team when they tried to win the division at home against Green Bay. It's the same story that derailed so many of these teams because of how poorly they could or couldn't block up front. A consistent theme through all those lines has been Garrett Bradbury at center. We keep talking about the guards. Could they move on at center, do you think?
I think it's possible. I mean, haven't looked at the contract enough. I don't think they'd be eating a lot of money if they moved on.
It was a cheap deal.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, I think they signed him to a cheap deal because they didn't like the free agent market very much. They've talked about Michael Juergens being a future starter in the NFL. Is he ready to do that next year? I mean, that would be the obvious question, I think, if you were going to move on from Garrett Bradbury. That's the cheapest way to do it.
Yeah, he was the backup all year.
Right. So if you feel good enough about where he's at, and especially if he's a little stronger, I mean, that's been the big knock on Garrett Bradbury. I think Garrett Bradbury they like his intelligence, they like his ability to help a quarterback set protections. I do wonder if that would be a benefit to a young quarterback, if you have a veteran center that can help you work through that. I mean, would that be a reason to keep Garrett Bradbury around here and say, let's put better guards next to him on both sides? Maybe, but I think it's possible that they would decide to go a different direction there and say, let's, if we're going to have J.J. McCarthy work with a new center at some point in his career, just do it now. I think there's probably an argument to be made for that, especially if you feel good enough about Michael Juergens.
Or call Joe Berger, see what he's up to. Sorry, that's an old offensive lineman.
I don't understand
It
that
does
one.
show
Just
how many years. I mean,
underrated.
you and I have been. This was year 13 on the beat for me that we just finished. I think year 12 for you. How
Yeah.
many years have we been talking about
Joe
you go back
Berger?
to
A
Joe
lot.
Berger, Joe Berger specifically, but like Alex Boone,
Yeah. Josh Klein.
Josh Klein,
Dakota Dozier,
oh my
Drew
gosh.
Samia.
Yeah. David Yankee.
Oh man, that's a throwback.
Willie Beavers.
Oh my gosh, yeah, Willie Beavers. Boy, who
Andre
else?
Smith, was that the guy?
Wow,
Emily's
he was
totally
a tackle.
bored with this.
He was a tackle.
He would, like he played guard a little bit. They could bounce
Did
him.
he? Did Jeremiah Searles,
Jeremiah
old friend?
Searles.
Jeremiah Searles was in that group.
There's another one.
He probably doesn't want to be lumped into that
Mike
group.
Harris.
Mike Harris.
Yep.
Yeah, he's
Yep.
a local coach now.
Yep.
Wow. Yeah, they've done this a long time,
Yeah.
and they have not found answers at guard.
Flinging him in there, as Rick Spielman once said.
They really keep doing that. Anyway, I think we should talk before we wrap
Brandon
this up.
Fusco.
And him too. Before we wrap this episode up, we should talk about the rest of their coaches, the uncertain futures with Flores, who's scheduled to interview for some jobs coming up here. Ben, you mentioned McCown and Udinsky.
Yeah.
Not to ask you to handicap the chances they stay or go, but what is the chance that they face some real brain drain here?
Well, Flores is the one that's the most interesting to me because he's interviewing with 3 teams. Yeah. So is somebody going to say, I want to hire you? The question also is, does Brian Flores want one of those jobs? Does he want to go work for the Bears? Does he want to go work for the Jets?
And the teenagers over there.
And the teenagers that make decisions off of Madden ratings, I guess. That's home.
Hey, Madden should love Grenard and Cashman.
Yeah, that's probably true. Now, if Ryan Grigson goes there, I mean, Ryan Grigson has been talking to them as well. Yeah. Maybe that changes things a little. McCown is talking to the Jets. I think Flores is probably the one that has the best chance to go. I also think he will be somewhat selective with his options. There are only 32 of these jobs, and this is shot number 2 for him. But he also, I think, is as much as anybody knows that if you don't click with the owner of the team that you are working for, it can be a very difficult place to be. So I think that's going to be a factor for him. But I do think he's got a decent chance to get a job. Josh McCown, this is probably a little early for him. He's had some head coaching interest in the past, I think, with Houston. And I think he's somebody that people see as a guy that can get up in front of a room and command a team and kind of deliver a message. I think all of that stuff is spoken well of him. Is this the time? I don't know. Maybe
it's just his second year as a quarterbacks coach
right,
in the NFL.
Right. So going quarterbacks coach to head coach is a big jump.
Yeah.
Going assistant quarterbacks coach to offensive coordinator is also a massive jump. So Grant Udinsky, the interview that the Seahawks have requested with him reportedly, I think some of that is, hey, this guy is a rising star in the league. That's how Kevin O'Connell has talked about him. Mm-hmm. He said, I think he's a future offensive coordinator or head coach even, but he's 28. He has not led a position room, I think, leading an offense, because that's a team with a defensive head coach. Yeah. So you would be calling plays, you're running offensive meetings. I think that's a lot if you're a 28-year-old who's only a couple of years removed from being hired here in an admin role. I mean, they hired him in an admin role, and they realized this guy knows way more than we would expect this job to be. And as Kevin O'Connell put it when I wrote about Grant earlier this year, he said it was like interviewing a guy that knows how to build a car for a job at a car wash. So it was pretty clear to them very early that his intelligence and his football intellect were going to price him out of that job pretty quickly. The thing I think is going to be very interesting to watch with that offensive staff is you have 2 coaches who are getting interest for jobs that are, in both cases, 2 levels above the ones they're currently working. Josh McCown is skipping from QB coach to head coach, at least in interviews. Grant Udinsky skipping from assistant QB coach to offensive coordinator. Do they do some things to keep those guys happy and keep them here? Kevin O'Connell knows that you can't do that forever. You're not going to be able to keep everybody in the building if they have opportunities to go elsewhere. But how do you do that if Wes Phillips is in the mix? Wes Phillips is under contract through 2025, as is Brian Flores. Yeah. So do you come up with some other job title for people? Some of this is academic because Kevin O'Connell is the one calling plays anyway. Right. But it's going to be very interesting to watch how all of that plays out, I think, on the offensive staff.
Yeah, we've seen teams interview guys for positions where maybe if they don't have the full intention of hiring them for that position, but Josh McCown, for instance, with the Jets would be a great offensive coordinator under Brian Flores.
I think that's a very good possibility.
Would have talked to both of them if that's the case. But I do wonder, you've talked to Flores a lot about this, just about what he would accept, and it just seems like those three teams we talk about, Jaguars, Jets, Bears, none of them scream stable ownership.
No.
And that's not the case for anybody typically looking for a head coach every year
anyway,
but especially those teams who are perennially looking for a new coach.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of dysfunction in the history of all three of those teams. I think that will be part of his decision if he gets to make that decision. It's not the Steelers looking for a replacement for Mike Tomlin. If that were the case, I think that's a different story. I mean, he worked there for a year, I think very much enjoyed the time there, enjoyed the Rooneys. I think all of that. I mean, the Rooneys are kind of one of those ownership groups that the Wills have talked about. We want to be this type of an ownership group, this stable family ownership that thinks long term. Every coach that Steelers have hired since the 1970s has won at least one Super Bowl. You know, that's a pretty good track record, I would say. They've hired 3, and all 3 of them have Lombardi trophies, at least one. And have each, I think, coached in a couple Super Bowls. So, you know, it's hard to beat that. But the jobs we're talking about are not those.
No.
So that will be a consideration for him too, I think.
It will. Well, that should be it for us on this episode of the podcast. Thank you all for watching, for listening. Please check us out at the Star Tribune YouTube channel, on the Access Vikings podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find all of this in some form or fashion at startribune.com.